My stepdad pushed me off a dock as a joke. The next day, I kicked his knee out and put him in physical therapy for 6 months. It took a stranger's overheard comment to make my mom finally believe me after 4 years throwaway account. Because my mom still checks my regular one sometimes, and I don't need this conversation happening twice. This is long, but I've been sitting on it for years, and I think I finally need to just get it all out in one place, so bear with me. And I'm going to try to lay out the whole timeline because context matters here. And I already know the top comment is going to be, NTA, give us the whole story. So here it is, start to finish, no skipping. My dad, Tom, died of a heart attack when I was 9. He just dropped in the garage while he was fixing the lawnmower on a Saturday morning. And by the time the paramedics got there, it was already over. He was 41. I remember the exact sound of my mom screaming his name from the driveway. And I remember not understanding for a solid few minutes that this was the kind of thing that didn't get fixed. My mom, Denise, was 34 at the time, and suddenly a widow with an only kid, a mortgage, and a car that was still technically in my dad's name because they'd never gotten around to updating the paperwork. I'm not going to pretend those next 4 years were easy for either of us. She worked as a claims processor at a regional insurance office, 9 to 5 plus overtime whenever she could get it, and for a long stretch it was just the two of us eating cereal for dinner some nights and watching whatever rerun was on because neither of us had the energy to do anything else. We had a system. Tuesdays were her late nights at the office. So I'd walk myself the 6 blocks home from school and let myself in with the spare key under the fake rock. And I got pretty good, for a 9, 10, 11-year-old, at making myself dinner and doing my own homework, and generally not being a burden, because I could tell, even then, how thin she was stretched. I loved her a lot during that time, genuinely, unreservedly. She tried so hard, and I want that on the record before I say anything else, because a lot of what follows is going to make her sound bad, and she was not a bad person. She was a scared, exhausted, lonely person who made one very bad call at a vulnerable moment and then spent years refusing to fully look at it, which I think is a very human thing to do, even if it cost me a lot. When I was 12, going on 13, a guy from her office named Grant started asking her out. He'd apparently been circling for almost a year before she finally said yes, bringing her coffee she didn't ask for, offering to fix her car when it made a weird noise, doing the whole persistent, attentive, nice guy routine that I now understand a lot of women find genuinely disarming after years of being alone and unnoticed. Grant was a regional sales manager for a company that distributed commercial HVAC parts, mid-40s at the time, divorced with no kids of his own, drove a truck that was nicer than anything we'd ever owned, and had this booming, hearty laugh that filled up whatever room he was in and made him seem, at least on the surface, like the most confident, easygoing guy you'd ever meet. My mom lit up around him in a way I genuinely hadn't seen since before my dad died, and I remember being happy for her. Actually happy, even though something about the way Grant looked at me sort of passed me. Through me, like I was a piece of furniture that had wandered into the frame of a photo he was trying to take of my mother. Never quite sat right in my stomach. It took me a long time to be able to name what that feeling was. Looking back now, I think I clocked it on some instinctive level before I ever had the vocabulary for it. He was warm and attentive toward my mom, and he was flatly, almost administratively indifferent toward me. And by the time we'd all been around each other a handful of times, he wasn't even bothering to hide the indifference once the metaphorical cameras were off. Whenever it was just the two of us in a room, waiting for my mom to finish getting ready somewhere, or riding in his truck while he picked her up from work, his whole demeanor would flatten out. He'd sigh, audibly, theatrically, if he had to swing by and drop me at a friend's house on his way to something. More than once, in a voice that was clearly pitched to carry into whatever room my mom was in, he made comments about how expensive kids were, how much they ate, how much their activities cost, and how relieved he was that he'd dodged that bullet with his ex-wife and never had to deal with any of it himself. He said this, one time specifically that I remember vividly, while I was sitting maybe 6 feet away at the kitchen table doing algebra homework, close enough to hear every word, which I have to assume was the point. My mom, when I brought this up to her once, gently, in the careful way a 12-year-old tries to broach something he's not sure he's allowed to be upset about, told me he was probably just stressed about work and that I shouldn't read into it too much. That response, some version of, "You're reading into it, you're being too sensitive, that's just how he is," became something of a load-bearing pillar of my entire adolescence, so keep it in your back pocket, because it's going to come up again and again. They dated for about a year and a half and then got engaged over a weekend trip to the coast that I wasn't invited on, which in hindsight was maybe the first real sign of how this was all gonna go. Though at the time I told myself it was just a romantic couples thing and didn't think much more of it. I remember being cautiously fine with the engagement itself, because 13-year-old me still genuinely wanted to believe that Grant just needed more time to warm up to the idea of a stepson, that this was some kind of adjustment period rather than a settled personality trait. The wedding was where things really started to crack for me, though. About 3 weeks before the ceremony, my mom sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd overheard the "dodged a bullet" comment, and told me very gently, in a voice I could tell she'd rehearsed, that Grant felt it would be less complicated and more elegant if I wasn't part of the wedding party, and that honestly it might be simplest if I just sat with the other guests instead of standing up front at all. His reasoning, relayed to me secondhand through my own mother, because he apparently couldn't be bothered to tell me himself, was that a kid standing up there would make the whole thing feel gimmicky and would distract from the romance of the moment. I was 14 years old, sitting in a folding chair in the 4th row of white chairs on a golf course lawn, watching my own mother marry a man who had just informed me in so many words that my physical presence at the front of the ceremony was an aesthetic problem to be managed and minimized. Nobody in that entire venue but me seemed to think that was strange. I clapped when I was supposed to clap. I ate the cake, which was lemon, and I still don't love lemon cake. I told my mom afterward it was a beautiful ceremony, because it was objectively a beautiful ceremony, and because I didn't yet have the emotional tools at 14 to separate beautiful ceremony from the specific hollow feeling of watching it happen from the 4th row. That day was, I think now, the actual beginning of about 2 years, roughly ages 14 to 16, that I've come to think of, privately, as the joke years. Grant discovered, somewhere in the first few months of actually living under the same roof as me, that mocking me was basically a hobby he could indulge from the comfort of his own recliner. And once he started, he never really stopped. Nothing was ever too small to comment on. He'd ask about my report card at dinner and then, in front of company if there was any, make a remark like, "Well, we can't all be geniuses," if I got a B+ in anything less than his exact expectations, which were never actually stated, just applied retroactively. I started a part-time job bagging groceries the summer I turned 15 specifically, so I could buy my own clothes, because I'd already learned that anything my mom bought me got critiqued by Grant at the dinner table. Too baggy, too expensive looking, trying too hard. And I figured if I paid for it myself with my own paycheck, he'd have less standing to comment on it. He commented anyway. He'd look at a hoodie I'd picked out and paid for with my own money and say something like, "Interesting choice," in a tone that somehow made 2 flat words feel like an entire paragraph of contempt. And then he'd look over at my mom like he expected her to laugh along, and usually, exhausted and conflict-averse after years of it, she did. He made fun of my 2 closest friends, Marcus and Priya, calling them the misfits to my face on multiple occasions, and once, directly to their faces when they came over to pick me up for a movie, which was its own uniquely humiliating flavor of experience, watching my friends' expressions shift as they realized this was just how my house worked now. If I so much as mentioned a girl's name once, he'd bring it up at every single dinner for the following month, doing this exaggerated baby voice, asking if we'd kissed yet in front of my mother, who would laugh along like it was the funniest recurring bit in the world, instead of watching her son's face get redder and smaller every single time. Every single time I tried to say something about any of this, and I did try, more than a few times over those 2 years, sitting my mom down the way she'd once sat me down about the wedding, she gave me some version of the exact same response. "You need to relax a little." That's just how Grant shows affection. Some men just aren't good with feelings, so they tease instead. He doesn't mean anything by it, honey. You're too sensitive. I want to be clear, even now, that I don't think my mom was consciously lying to me during any of this. I think she genuinely believed what she was saying, because believing it was so much easier and so much less frightening than admitting she'd married a man who treated her only child, her only living connection to my father, like an inconvenience she'd already apologized enough times for. So we limped along like that for 2 years. This uneasy, unspoken arrangement where I absorbed a steady drip of humiliation, and my mom kept the peace by telling me I was imagining the water level rising. Then, the summer I turned 16, we took a family trip up to a lake about 3 hours from home, renting a cabin from a couple named Walt and Doreen Higgins, who ran a little cluster of rental cabins and a bait-and-tackle shop right on the property. The kind of place with a hand-painted sign and a screen door that slammed. It was supposed to be a full week. The first day was actually good. Genuinely. Which in hindsight makes what happened next hurt worse rather than better. Grant was in a weirdly great mood the whole drive up, cracking jokes that weren't at my expense for once, singing badly along to the radio, helping me carry the cooler down the trail to the dock without a single comment about how heavy or awkward it was. He even asked me, unprompted, about a video game I'd been playing that summer, and listened to the answer. Actually listened, nodding along like he cared. And I remember thinking, almost against my will, with this small flicker of hope I hadn't let myself feel in a long time, that maybe this trip was going to be some kind of turning point. Maybe getting him away from the routine and the audience of home was going to shake something loose in him. Day 2, we went out to the end of the dock to fish before breakfast, just the two of us. My mom still asleep back at the cabin. We stood there for a while with our lines in the water, not talking much, which was fine, comfortable even. And then, out of absolutely nowhere, with zero warning, zero buildup, Grant shoved me, hard, with both hands flat against my back, right between the shoulder blades. I went face first off the dock into the lake, fully clothed, phone in my pocket, car keys and all, and my rod went flying one direction while I went the other. I came up gasping, disoriented, water in my nose, my phone already dead by the time I fished it out of my soaked pocket, my rod nowhere in sight, probably sitting on the bottom of that lake to this day. When I finally hauled myself back up onto the dock, dripping and furious and honestly a little scared for a second there, and asked him what the hell that was for, Grant was already doubled over laughing, hands braced on his knees, laughing so hard he was wheezing. He told me between gasps that I was way too sensitive, and that it was just a joke. Lighten up. You should have seen your face. I walked back to the cabin dripping wet, humiliated, my dead phone in my fist. And when Grant told my mom the story over breakfast an hour later, doing a whole animated performance of it, complete with sound effects and a reenactment of my flailing arms, she laughed too. She actually laughed, looked over at me still standing there in a dry shirt with my jaw tight, and told me to stop sulking and go help set up the fire pit instead of making a big deal out of it. My phone sat in a bag of rice on the kitchen counter for the rest of the trip, screen dark, and nobody, not Grant and not my mom, offered to replace it or even really acknowledge that it was now, functionally, a paperweight. So here's where I have to be honest about what I did next, because I know this is the part where the judgment is really going to land, one way or the other. Day 3, Grant wanted to go back out fishing again, and I said sure, because some genuinely stupid, cold, focused part of 16-year-old me had already, somewhere overnight, decided I was going to get him back. I didn't have a fully formed plan sitting there in bed the night before. I just knew I was furious in a way that felt different from the usual low simmer, and that an apology was never ever going to come on its own, and that if I brought it up again out loud, I'd get told again to relax, to lighten up, to stop being so sensitive. We were out at the same spot on the same dock, the water still a little choppy from an overnight wind, and at some point Grant bent forward at the waist, focused on something with his line, all his weight forward on one leg the way you do when you're paying attention to something else entirely and have forgotten your own body exists. And I kicked the back of his knee. Not a shove, not a playful push into the water the way he'd done to me the day before. A direct, deliberate kick to the back of his leg, hard enough that his knee buckled sideways underneath him, and he went down into the lake at a genuinely bad angle, his whole body twisting as he fell, one arm flailing for the dock rail and missing it. He came up out of the water red-faced, sputtering, absolutely furious, screaming at me, asking what the hell I thought I was doing, asking if I was actually trying to kill him, and I said, and I remember this part with total clarity, because it turns out I'd apparently been saving it up word for 2 solid years without even realizing it, that it was just a joke, and that he should learn to take one. I want to be completely honest that in that exact moment, standing on that dock, watching him thrash in the shallows, it felt like justice, clean and immediate, and finally earned. That feeling lasted about 90 seconds, because when Grant tried to stand up out of the shallow water near the dock, he could not put weight on his leg at all. Not even a little, and he went right back down with a sound I still think about sometimes. This short, sharp cry that had nothing performative in it whatsoever. His knee had already started swelling by the time we half-carried, half-dragged him back to the cabin, and within an hour it had swelled to roughly twice its normal size, tight and shiny and discolored, and he could not walk on it at all, could not even stand on it, was gray in the face and sweating in a way that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Walt, the cabin owner, ended up driving all 3 of us into the nearest town in his pickup, because none of our own cars could realistically get down the rutted access road fast enough or comfortably enough for someone in that kind of pain. And Doreen rode along in the truck bed of a second vehicle with a cooler she'd hastily filled with ice from the shop, holding Grant's hand through the back window the whole bumpy ride like he was her own family, instead of a stranger renting cabin 4. The doctor at the little urgent care clinic in town, a converted house with a hand-lettered sign that said, "Hours, see door," examined the knee, ordered an x-ray to rule out a fracture, and told us that at minimum it was a severe sprain, and that there was a real, specific possibility of ligament damage that would need a proper orthopedic workup once we got home. They gave him crutches, a knee immobilizer brace, a prescription for pain medication, and strict instructions to keep weight off it entirely until he could see a specialist. My mom cried the entire drive back to the cabin, sitting in the front seat of Walt's truck with her hand pressed over her mouth. Not out of sympathy for Grant, or not only that. She cried because she kept turning around to look at me in the back seat, like she genuinely didn't recognize what she was seeing. Back at the cabin that night, once Grant was propped up on the couch with his leg elevated on a stack of throw pillows, she absolutely lost it on me in the kitchen, asking, voice shaking, how I could hurt someone like that, telling me over and over that she didn't know who I was anymore, that she raised me better than this, that this wasn't the kid she knew. And something in me just broke open right there at the kitchen counter, standing next to that dead phone still sitting in its bag of rice, because I had spent 2 solid years being told to relax, being told it was just how he showed affection, being told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. And here was a grown man on crutches in the next room because I had finally, physically, in one impulsive 10-second act, done to him a fraction, one single fraction, of what he had been doing to me, calmly, deliberately for 2 years. And suddenly, only now, it was a 5-alarm crisis worth crying over. I told her everything, all at once. 4 years worth of it in one long, unbroken stream, starting with being cut out of the wedding at 14 and going all the way through the mockery at every single dinner, the humiliation in front of my own friends, the baby voice about girls, the dodged a bullet comment I'd overheard when I was 12 and had apparently just filed away and never mentioned until that exact moment, my dead phone still sitting on the counter 2 feet away from where we were standing. I told her about every single time over the years I'd tried to tell her, gently, carefully, the way she'd taught me to, and been brushed off, redirected, told to relax. She just stood there, stunned, one hand braced on the counter, saying over and over in this small, hollow voice that she thought we were just teasing each other, that she thought it was mutual, that she had genuinely actually had no idea it had ever gotten that bad, no idea I'd been carrying that much weight around for that long. I don't think she was lying to me in that moment either. I think, honestly, she had spent 4 years actively, if unconsciously, refusing to let herself see the full shape of it, because seeing it clearly meant admitting she'd let it happen, chapter and verse under her own roof. The real turning point of the whole trip, though, wasn't even that raw, tearful conversation in the kitchen. It was later that same night, close to 11, when Doreen came back over to the cabin with another fresh bag of ice for Grant's knee, and while she was standing in our kitchen with my mom waiting for the kettle, she mentioned, almost completely offhand, like it was just a piece of small talk, that she and Walt had actually seen the whole thing on day 2 from their own porch up the hill, Grant shoving me off the dock the whole thing, start to finish, and that they'd heard him laughing about it afterward down at the bait shop that same morning, retelling it to another guest at the counter like it was a great, funny anecdote from his vacation. Doreen said, very plainly, very matter-of-factly, not even really to me, mostly to my mother, that in her own honest opinion, that hadn't looked like a joke from where she was standing. It had looked mean, plain and simple, and that whatever had happened on the dock the very next day sure hadn't come out of nowhere as far as she could tell. I wasn't even in the room for most of that particular conversation. I was in the back bedroom, door cracked, pretending to be asleep. But my mom told me much later that something about hearing it from a total stranger, a woman with absolutely no stake in our family, no history, no reason to take a side, cracked something open in her that 4 years of me saying the exact same thing, in every possible tone, from calm to desperate, had somehow never managed to do. I'm not especially proud of the fact that it apparently took an outsider's casual comment to be believed after everything I'd already said myself, but that, in the end, is what it actually took. We went home a day early, the cabin refund waived by Walt and Doreen out of what I can only describe as pity, and Grant saw an orthopedic specialist within the week. The imaging showed a partially torn ligament in his knee, not a full, complete tear, which the specialist said we should genuinely be grateful for, but enough of a tear that he needed months of structured physical therapy, was on crutches for close to 6 weeks, and then in a hinged brace for a long while after that, and had to take a significant chunk of unpaid leave from work because his job involved a fair amount of driving and standing in warehouses. I felt genuinely, physically sick about the actual injury itself, for whatever that's worth on this website. I never once wanted him seriously, permanently hurt. I wanted him, in some crude 16-year-old sense of proportional justice, to feel a fraction of what he'd made me feel, and I badly, dangerously miscalculated the physics of a grown man's body weight coming down wrong on a wet dock in a way that could have gone so much worse than it did. My mom insisted, once we were all home and the initial shock had settled into something more like a cold, tense standoff, that we go to family therapy together, all three of us, which Grant resisted hard at first, showing up to the very first session basically to perform the role of the deeply wronged party. He told the therapist, a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Feldman with a lot of very patient silences, that I had serious anger management issues and that this whole incident on the dock proved it beyond any doubt. Dr. Feldman, to her enormous and lasting credit, didn't just nod along and take that framing at face value. She asked Grant, very calmly, very evenly, to give her some specific, concrete examples of how he tried to bond with me over the past 2 years, since that was the exact word he kept reaching for, that he was just a guy trying to bond with a difficult teenager who wouldn't let him in. And Grant, apparently thinking he was building his case, started listing things off one after another. The comments about my clothes, the jokes about my grades, the needling about girls in front of my mom, the dock shove itself, which he described, unprompted, as just messing around, and you could watch it land on him in real time. Watch him hear his own greatest hits read back out loud in a quiet therapist's office instead of delivered at his own dinner table with an audience laughing along and just stop talking mid-sentence, mouth still open. Nobody said anything for a solid 10-15 seconds. My mom was staring at her own hands in her lap. That was the session where she finally broke down completely and admitted, out loud in front of both of us, that she had been so deeply afraid of ending up alone again after my dad died, so afraid of losing the one relationship that had made her feel like herself again after 4 years of grief, that she had made herself not see how bad things had actually gotten between Grant and me, and that she had been telling me for years that I was too sensitive, because it was so much easier than admitting her husband was being genuinely, repeatedly cruel to her only son. She apologized to me in that room in a way she genuinely never had before. Not the quick, reflexive, sorry, hun, I love you kind of apology I'd gotten 100 times, but a slow, specific one, naming actual incidents, actual dinners, actual things she should have said and hadn't. It didn't fix 4 years overnight, obviously, nothing does that, but it mattered more than I think I let on to her at the time. Over the following 6 months, while Grant slogged through twice-weekly physical therapy appointments and slowly, painfully got his knee back to something close to normal function, things in the house changed gradually and unevenly, the way real change actually happens in real families instead of the way it happens in a 2-hour movie. My mom started actually cutting Grant off mid-sentence at the dinner table if he started in on me about something, even something small, which she had genuinely never once done in 4 years. She started asking me directly, looking right at me, how I was doing, instead of asking Grant how I was doing or just assuming things were fine because nobody was actively yelling. Grant, for his part, never once apologized to me directly for the 4 years leading up to that lake trip, not in therapy, not privately. Not ever. And I, for my part, never apologized to him for the knee, which I already know is going to bother a decent chunk of people reading this. But that is honestly exactly where the two of us landed, and where we've more or less stayed ever since. We don't hug it out. We're not close, not even a little, and I don't think we ever will be. What we have now, after those 6 months of slow, awkward, hard-won progress, is something closer to a truce than a relationship. He doesn't comment on my clothes or my grades or my friends anymore. Not once. And I don't go out of my way to make his life difficult or bring up old grievances at family dinners, and we mostly just stay out of each other's orbit at holidays and gatherings, speaking when spoken to, keeping things civil and shallow, which honestly, genuinely, is a massive upgrade from where we started. My mom and I are in a much better, much more honest place now than we've been since before my dad died. We actually talk, really talk, and I think some real, if extremely expensive and physically painful good, came out of that entire disaster of a lake trip, even if I'd never in a million years recommend the method. I'm 19 now, most of the way through my first year of college, mostly out of that house except for holidays and the occasional weekend, and I've had a lot of time and a lot of physical distance now to sit with, whether what I did that morning on the dock was actually justified, or whether I just got lucky it wasn't worse. Part of me still genuinely believes Grant earned every bit of that torn ligament after 2 solid years of treating me like a punchline he never once got tired of telling. Another part of me knows, with total clarity now, that a fully torn ligament, a fractured kneecap, a much worse fall onto the dock itself instead of into the water, any number of significantly worse outcomes could have happened that morning. and that I got lucky, genuinely lucky, that it wasn't worse, and that he did it to me first, isn't actually, on its own, a complete moral defense for putting a grown man in 6 months of physical therapy over what was, at the end of the day, still a deliberate, planned act on my part, rather than a reflex. My friend Marcus, who watched a good chunk of this unfold from the outside over those 2 years, tells me pretty firmly that I have nothing to feel guilty about and that Grant is lucky it was only a knee and not something worse. My college roommate, who I told this entire story to over a very long night a few months back, said that I was completely justified in being angry, furious even, but that the kick itself was still a genuinely dangerous, disproportionate physical act to commit against another person, regardless of how many years of provocation quietly built up to it. And that both of those things, the justified anger and the dangerous overreaction, can be fully true at the exact same time without canceling each other out. So Reddit, Aida for kicking my stepdad's knee out from under him on a fishing dock and landing him in 6 months of physical therapy over what he insisted, right up until the moment he heard himself say it out loud in a quiet therapist's office, was just a joke.